Thanks, everyone, and thanks again for being here for this introduction to elevation certificates. What we're going to do today is cover the different sections of the form. We'll talk briefly about why these elevation certificate forms are so useful for helping you all as floodplain managers check for the building's compliance with elevation requirements. We'll go through the form section by section, and we'll talk about different things you need to be paying attention to and things to look out for. We'll review the 11 different building diagrams that go along with the form, and we'll talk about how to kind of connect all the different pieces of information that you'll get from the elevation certificate to help determine what the building's lowest floor is, because it's not always the bottom floor, as we'll get into. Got a couple examples to sort of pull as knowledge checks to sort of pull it all together, as well as I can sprinkle throughout this. We'll talk a little bit about common errors of the form as well. And really the reason that we're talking about elevation certificates today is because it really helps you tie back to the minimum National Flood Insurance Program standards for elevation of buildings in that special flood hazard area. These are the requirements in your local ordinances and building codes. So the NFIP requires that any new or substantially improved structures that are built or substantially improved in the special flood hazard area, that regulatory floodplain, have to have their lowest floor elevated to or above the base flood elevation at a minimum. You may be in a community that uses higher standards, like additional feet of freeboard above the BFE, but at the bare minimum, lowest floor is elevated to or above the base flood elevation. Non-residential buildings can choose to be dry flood proofed instead of elevated to that same level of protection. And then again, according to the NFIP minimum standards, not only do communities have to make sure that that's happening, they're required to obtain and maintain a record of the as-built lowest floors for those buildings, for new and substantially improved buildings. And what do we mean by the lowest floor? Well, the NFIP defines the lowest floor in the Code of Federal Regulations in this very kind of long and convoluted way. It says the lowest floor is the lowest floor of the lowest enclosed area, including basement. And then it goes on to provide some exceptions. It says an unfinished or flood-resistant enclosure that's used solely for parking of vehicles, building access, or storage in an area that's not a basement isn't necessarily considered the building's lowest floor, provided that that enclosure below BFE isn't built so as to render the structure in violation of these other design requirements. And I'll kind of explain what that means, but I just wanted to show you this definition and say that the lowest floor may or may not be the basement, and it may or may not be the bottom floor, depending on what else is going on with the building. And the elevation certificate information can help you determine that. So that lowest floor, per that definition, changes when a building meets certain conditions and requirements. Your job as a local official is to make sure the lowest floor is at or above BFE. You have to collect certified elevation information. You don't have to use the elevation certificate form unless you're in CRS. But the FEMA Elevation Certificate is a form that's designed specifically to capture the kind of information that you're going to need, including the base flood elevation or depth at a site, the elevation of floor or multiple floors of a building, information about flood openings, attached garages, and other characteristics. So that's why we're going to talk about the elevation certificate today. Again, it's designed specifically to collect elevation and BFE data that local floodplain administrators need to assess a building's compliance with your own local ordinance and the NFIP regulations. Information on the elevation certificate can also be used to support letters of map change, like letters of map amendment, letters of map revision based on fill. And if your community is participating in the Community Rating System or CRS program, which provides discounts on flood insurance for communities that go above and beyond the minimum NFIP standards and do additional activities, those CRS communities must use the elevation certificate form to capture elevation information. It's optional but highly recommended for all communities to use this form because of the way it captures all the information that you need. A completed elevation certificate is no longer required to rate a post-firm flood insurance policy, but it is useful for insurance rating purposes as well. and it does provide information that can help in any flood zone, inside or outside the SFHA, to provide a flood insurance information to rate a flood insurance policy. Remember, anyone in an NFIP participating community is eligible for flood insurance, so that's why I say may be used in any flood zone. You don't have to be in the floodplain to get flood insurance. FEMA updates this form from time to time, and so it's important to always pay attention to see that you're receiving the current version of the form. The current version is the 2023 edition. It's got an expiration date up in the upper right corner of 6/30/2026. You can get it from FEMA's underwriting page along with other forms like the dryer floodproofing certificate. But again, always use the newest version of the form, and you can go ahead right to that website and download that form. While the blank forms expire from time to time, it's important to distinguish that a completed elevation certificate form for a structure does not expire unless there's some sort of physical change to the building that would make that EC that was filled out invalid. Say they add another floor, or maybe they added an attached garage, or some other internal or external change to the building that would invalidate the old EC. You can continue to use that old EC because it has that certified as-built information. All right, you'll have a chat box in your WebEx features, and if you kind of open that chat box, let me know what you think, yes or no. Does having an elevation certificate, someone hands you an elevation certificate for a building, does that mean the building is compliant? Yes or no? All right, I'm seeing some no's pop up. That's correct. The elevation certificate form, having one completed, is simply a report of existing conditions. The surveyor or the professional engineer who fills out the elevation certificate for the applicant and provides it to you as a local official, they're simply certifying or stamping in section D of the form that the elevations that they recorded are accurate and correct. It does not certify that those elevations reflect a NFIP compliant structure. It's your job as the local official to review all the information on the EC form for completeness and accuracy and that determination of whether or not the lowest floor of the building is at or above the BFE. These are also important records to maintain under your record-keeping responsibilities. So as I mentioned, the current edition of the form is the 2023 edition, and we'll go through the form section by section. They're lettered A through H and I now, as well as a couple pages for EC photographs. We'll spend a little bit of time on the 11 different building diagrams that are noted in section A and that relate to other sections of the form. And as I said, we'll weave in that lowest floor discussion. If you have any questions as we go along, try and type them into that chat box, and I'll do my best to keep an eye on that and answer them as we go along, or there'll be plenty of time for questions after the end. All right, starting at the very beginning, before we get into the various sections, the newest version of the form has this neat feature where the form instructions pages, there are several pages of detailed instructions that help surveyors, architects, individuals who are completing other sections of the form understand what kind of information needs to go in each field and in what format. You can click that little button in the upper left-hand corner to toggle between the instructions pages and the pages of the actual form. So in section A, we're collecting property information. Anybody can fill out section A of the form. It doesn't take a special license to complete this section. But here we're gathering information about the property. Who owns the property? What's the physical address of the property? There's also a spot for lat longs or tax or parcel numbers, a property description for maybe buildings that aren't yet constructed, or a parcel where you're trying to collect information on something that doesn't physically have a street address yet. We'll collect information on the type or use of the building. Is it a residential structure, a non-residential structure? Is this an accessory building like a detached garage that might need its own elevation certificate? And then it goes on to collect information about the type of building or foundation type that this is. What's how is the building designed and what's holding up the building. Is it a slab-on-grade building? Is it elevated on piers or posts? Is it on a crawl space? We'll go through those building diagrams. The rest of the section talks about information for buildings with either crawl spaces or enclosures, or buildings with attached garages. So if either of those or both of those are present for the building, you'd fill out those portions as well. A7 is kind of one of the most important pieces for Section A, because proper building diagram selection is really important for interpreting the rest of the form. So determining what elevations of which floors we need to be looking at, whether that's surveyed elevations or actual measurements, in order to properly complete the EC and to provide you with enough information to determine that building's compliance. So important to make sure that Section A is fully filled out, and also that the surveyor or person filling out the form selects the correct building diagram number and provides enough photographs of the actual building from multiple different angles and sides that capture the characteristics that support or agree with that building diagram. There are 11 different building diagram types. They're numbered 1 through 9, which is kind of confusing, but that set of building diagram types represents kind of the breadth of different ways that a building may be constructed. So always check A7. There are building diagrams, drawings that go along with each of these in the instructions, and we'll go through those one by one. But just wanted to point that out because it does inform a lot of other things that we look at in later sections of the form. As I mentioned, if the building either has a crawl space or enclosure or an attached garage or both, somebody may be filling out sections A8 of the form for those enclosures or A9 of the form for attached garages. So for NFIP compliance, any enclosures below the BFE that would be subject to flooding have to have proper venting to equalize that hydrostatic and hydrodynamic pressure. And that typically means flood openings. So they need flood openings which are permanent openings that allow for the free or automatic passage of water without human intervention. So these are things that are just going to let water come in to those areas below BFE and let water pass right back out. We're not going to damage the foundation with all that internal or external pressure of water. We're going to let the water pass right through. No human action needs to happen. You don't need to open a vent or open a garage door or do something that just automatically happens. You have to have at least 2 openings, and the building code says they should be on at least 2 different sides of the enclosure, but at a minimum you need 2 flood openings. But you'll probably need more because those openings must provide a total net area of at least 1 square inch of flood opening for every square foot of area enclosed. So let's say you have an 800 square foot enclosure, crawl space under the building, you need 800 inches of flood opening to make sure you have enough open area to let the water come in and out for that size of a crawl space. Those flood openings have to be pretty close to the ground level or the adjacent grade. The bottom of the flood openings, per the NFIP regulations, have to be within 1 foot of the adjacent grade, either the interior or the exterior grade. So we'll only count those flood openings that are close enough to the ground, and we want to make sure that we have 1 square inch of opening per square foot of enclosed area. And the newest version of the elevation certificate recognizes that sometimes buildings will have non-engineered or just standard holes in the crawl space or foundation, non-engineered flood openings. Some buildings have engineered flood openings, which have movable parts that allow the water to go in and out of the enclosure, but they still do not require any human intervention. There's no electrical signals that need to happen. There's nothing. It's still just a passive system, but it's a closure that flaps open under flood conditions. Some buildings are using both of those types. So the elevation certificate now has some additional subfields in A8 and A9 to talk about the square footage. Is there at least 1 permanent flood opening on 2 different sides? That's for compliance with building codes in areas like that. And then enter the permanent number of flood openings that are both non-engineered or engineered. If the building's only using 1 type, that's okay. Write the number of the type that it has and write NA for the other one. Standard flood openings, again, we've got that 1-to-1 ratio for NFIP compliance. And engineered flood openings will have different certified design and performance criteria, and they may have a rating of amount of square feet per flood opening. So you'll have to do some additional calculations, or you'll have to make sure that the person submitting the form does that. And it's important to calculate the net opening area of the flood openings. You have to subtract any covered area like grates or decorative items or louvers or grills. So you want the net open area. So let's say, 20% of that faceplate or grill is actually covered by solid metal. You'll have to do the calculations to subtract that out so that you have a net open area. Sometimes they're covered in mesh. Sometimes they have these decorative faceplates. If they have louvers or grates or grills, something that can be toggled on and off or closed and opened, they have to be broken off in the open position. So if it can close, you can't count it as a passive opening, because what if it's closed and the owner's not there and the flood comes, has to require no human intervention. So nothing that can be closed can be counted. Here's an example of those engineered flood openings. Those look like they're closed, but again, they have a passive engineered system that will open up under flood conditions. If you've got something like this 1/4-inch mesh screen, you don't have to do a subtraction for net opening, but for nice thicker pieces like this, you'll have to do a little bit of that calculation. As I mentioned, engineered flood openings typically come with an ICC-ES or International Code Council certification or evaluation report that describes the kind of flood opening it is, as well as its rated area. So let's say each of these engineered flood openings is rated to cover 220 square feet of enclosure. There's space on the form to enter the actual size of the openings and explain what they're certified to cover, and then do the multiplication. We have, 4 engineered flood openings at 220 square feet each, and so those 4 openings will cover 880 square feet of enclosure. And the form in A8 or A9 will allow you to do that. If engineered flood openings are used on a building, it's important to make sure that that is attached, that ICC-ES evaluation report is attached to the form. For this and a lot more information about flood openings, FEMA has one of several different useful technical bulletins. TB1 is the requirements for flood openings in foundation walls and walls of enclosures. FEMA updates these from time to time. This one was last updated in March 2020. It's got some useful diagrams, some things to consider, some calculations and measurements. You can find this one and several others at fema.gov/NFIP-technical-bulletins. We'll talk about a couple of other TBs as we go through today's presentation. So, as I mentioned, A8 is for enclosures and A9 is for attached garages. Enclosures are those areas that are below an elevated building that's fully enclosed by walls. So elevated building types are building diagrams 5 through 9. And so the building in this case may be elevated by piers or posts, or it may be elevated on full-story solid foundation walls with flood openings. These areas down here, even though they have garage doors, are considered enclosures. Attached garages are those that are adjacent or beside or next to the principal structure of the building. They're not below grade on all sides. They have at least one side of the garage above grade. They might be connected to the main structure by a common wall or a shared roof. Might be a breezeway with a shared roof like this, or some other way that the foundation is shared or connected. Again, there are photograph pages on the elevation certificate, so it's important to take pictures and document in the comments section how that garage is attached. Sometimes it's a little bit tricky for folks to determine the difference between an enclosure or an attached garage if you have elevated building types. Often we'll see this in piers, posts, or piles, buildings on the coast. But the other one that tends to be tricky is those buildings that are elevated on a full-story masonry foundation. These diagram 7 buildings. Areas that are below the lowest floor, or sorry, below the elevated floor, are considered enclosures, even if they look and act like a garage area. FEMA actually has a new fact sheet about this, and it's at that link here. And again, Sarah will get you guys these slides after the session, but you can look up that FEMA fact sheet on enclosures versus attached garages and how to complete the elevation certificate in both of those scenarios. So here's an example side by side. The building on the left is elevated on piers, posts, and piles, and it's got a partial breakaway wall enclosure. This is a southeast coastal building, but we have a garage area, but this is not an attached garage because it's in a partially enclosed area of that pier, post, or pile foundation. So on the left, we have a parking enclosure. You can see some flood openings on it. The measurements for that area that's used for parking would go in A8 for an enclosure. The one on the right is an attached garage. It's adjacent or beside or next to the principal use of the building. It also has some flood vents you can kind of see behind the little arrow I put here. It's got a nice elevated machinery and equipment, condenser pad and everything. So this attached garage information goes in A9. So kind of an important side by side here. All right, so that's section A of the form where we're collecting that property information. Section B, we're going to collect flood insurance rate map information. So now that we know where the building is, what its use is, and some information about its building diagram number, we're going to figure out where it is in the community. So there are fields for both the community name as well as the 6-digit community ID number for a community, the flood insurance rate map panel, as well as the index panel number and date, the flood zone or zones that building is located in. Might be two zones. Maybe it's partially in X and partially in AE. Maybe you have a building that's, that crosses two zones. You're always going to use the information from the more restrictive zone. We talk about this in terms of if you've got maybe a building, let's say in Nevada, that crosses partially in an A zone and partially in an AE, you'll have that BFE information. In the AE zone, you'll use that more restrictive information. B9 is where you capture the base flood elevation information, or in zone AO where we have depth instead of BFE, we're going to enter that base flood depth. You'll put the number as detailed as possible, as well as the units of measure, so feet. Indicate the source, the elevation datum that's used on the map. Older maps have NGBD 29. Most newer maps are NAVD 1988. And then a couple of coastal information items that you're not going to need in Nevada, but coastal barrier resources systems, or is the building located seaward of the limit of moderate wave action? Is it in a coastal AE zone? Is the other information that we get from the firm. So that probably means going to the Map Service Center or using your community's GIS layers to find a particular location, zoom in on it. This is an example of printing out a firmette, or a little mini firm, if you will, from the Map Service Center. I know this isn't a BFE class, but remember not to take the BFEs directly off the firm on these, using these wavy lines. These are rounded to the nearest whole foot. They can't be used alone, and they can't be interpolated between to estimate or round. You'll have to usually go to the flood insurance study in a riverine area for more detailed information. There is information to the nearest tenth of a foot that's sometimes printed on firms right at the riverine cross sections, those lettered cross sections. But often we'll need to go to the flood insurance study profiles or maybe floodway data tables to get that detailed information, measuring between riverine cross sections and then zooming in to find that particular location, the line that is the 1% annual chance flood line, and then carrying that location over to figure out what the actual elevation is in feet to the nearest tenth of a foot. As I mentioned, all that information in section B can come right off of the flood insurance rate maps. You'll need the map index and the map panel title blocks. Again, location of the community name, 6-digit community ID number, those map numbers, which typically now that FEMA is doing those maps on a county-wide basis, will differ slightly from the 6-digit community ID numbers. So you can get both of those From the title blocks, that suffix, which represents how many iterations of that map, how many versions of that map have been issued, goes in its own field, B5, as well as the dates of both the map panel in question and the full map index. FEMA updates the map index, which is kind of the table of contents for all the maps in a community, every time they update some or all of the flood insurance rate map panels. So if you're in a larger county, for example, and part of the county's maps are updated, but not all of them are updated, the map index number, or sorry, the map index date will have changed. So that map index date might be later than the firm date in question, but it'll never be earlier. Again, that map number is a 10-digit number, and then that lettered suffix goes in its own field. In B9, we're going to enter that base flood elevation to the nearest tenth of a foot in those Zone AE areas. We're going to use both the firm and the flood insurance study to do that. In an AO zone, the depth number is typically printed right on the firm, but you may be able to see shallow flooding information in the flood insurance study as well. If you've got A zones, you're either going to obtain, review, or reasonably utilize some other data source. If you have newer Zone A areas, you might have model back Zone A's where there's still a BFE available. If there's no other information in those Zone AEs, you're going to use an NA to say we don't have a base flood elevation in this Zone A. And then you'll complete section E and F of the form instead of section C and D on the form. And I'll explain why here as I go to section C. So A and B, everybody fills out, and you don't need a special license to do that. Now, depending on what flood zone the building's in, you're either going to have a surveyor or engineer fill out section C and certify that information in section D, or in flood zones without a base flood elevation, there are sections E and F of the form, which collect similar but less detailed information. So, section C is for zones with a base flood elevation or a base flood depth in the case of those AO zones, shallow flooding zones, 1 foot, 2 foot, maybe a velocity, maybe not. And so use of this section is required where there is a base flood elevation published by FEMA. It's not required for those AO zones, or sorry, A zones without a BFE, unless there's support that's needed if they're using this form for an application for a letter of map amendment or letter of map revision based on fill. In that case, because there's certified elevation information required by that letter of map change process, you've got to fill out these sections. In Nevada, the folks who are authorized to do section C and D of the form are licensed professional surveyors and professional engineers. Some other states also allow architects, but not very many of them. There are going to either tell you whether the building is, whether these elevations are collected on a yet to be constructed building based solely on the diagrams or the drawings, whether this is a building that's being constructed but not yet finished. Maybe, you know, they haven't started the vertical construction, but they've set the floor, but the machinery and equipment still isn't in place. You can collect some, but not all the information about a building under construction. Or that finished construction, which means that all machinery or equipment like furnaces, hot water heaters, AC units, and their associated equipment have been installed. All the final grading around the building is complete. That really means finished construction of as late as possible. You're going to collect that datum, that elevation datum that they're using to measure those elevations. You want to make sure that it's the same as is on the flood insurance rate map. So again, if you have older flood insurance rate maps that are NGBD 1929, but the surveyor used the more current datum of 88, it's important that they'll show you their conversion factor by checking yes and describing it in the comments field. So now we'll go through section C2A through H. And this is where we've got the fields for floors or multiple floors of the building, an attached garage if there is one, attached decks or stairs if there are one. If there's anything in A through H that a building does not have, then you'll write NA, but if there is a measurement, they're going to put it as accurately as possible and check feet. So that top of the bottom floor is the elevation measured at the least high enclosed area. That might be a building that's on a slab foundation, it might be a basement floor, it might be some like elevated floor up on piers, posts, or piles, it might be a crawl space enclosure, something similar like that. But whatever the least high enclosed area is, that goes in C2A. So here's a couple of photo examples of that. In this case, right, where this is that least high enclosed area, it looks like it's sort of a partial basement, kind of a walkout basement, or a dugout basement. And then here's a building up on piers, posts, or piles. Its top of the bottom floor, the least high enclosed area, is up here. If the building has multiple floors, it's going to have a bottom floor and a next higher floor. Again, that least high enclosed area is C2A, the bottom floor. Every building that's got all walls around something has a bottom floor. And then C2B, if there is one, goes in that next higher floor. Slab on grade one-story building would only have a C2A, and you'd have a not applicable for C2B. So I talked about the lowest floor, which is important for floodplain management, but you'll notice that I didn't talk about the lowest floor for either C2A or C2B, right? These are called the bottom floor or the next higher floor. There's no field on the elevation certificate for the lowest floor. So that bottom floor is just an objectively measured floor with the least high elevation. It's going to be the thing that goes in C2A, but this isn't necessarily going to be the lowest floor for NFIP compliance purposes. It might be the next higher floor if, let's say, our bottom floor is a crawl space that's properly vented, and we'll get into properly vented, unfinished, only used for storage, parking, and access. So remember that you're looking for is the lowest floor above the BFE. Don't just stop at C2A. Take a look at what's going on with the whole building. So keep this in mind as we go through the rest of the form, and then we'll do some exercises together at the end. But just remember that you're not necessarily just comparing C2A to your base flood elevation in B9. You're going to look at all the floors in the building diagram and what's happening in, let's say, the crawl space if there is one, or where the machinery and equipment is located to determine whether that structure complies with your local floodplain management ordinance. There's also a new section H and I in the form that are only used for flood insurance purposes, and they collect a first floor height that's at or above grade. They're not interested in the basement elevation. They're looking at the first floor at or above grade, and then they use some information about the building diagram. But this is also not a building's lowest floor for compliance purposes. This is just a flood insurance rating factor. As local floodplain managers, you're probably not going to use section H or I for anything, as we'll see when we get there. So moving on to C2C of the form, which I suspect for you all in Nevada will mostly be not applicable. Don't leave blanks on an elevation certificate. Use that non-applicable or NA if there's nothing to measure or if that information isn't applicable to the building or the flood zone. In coastal areas, for those building diagram numbers 5 or 6 that are elevated on piers, posts, or piles, with or without an enclosure, that underside of the floor, so we've got C2A, C2C, which is, oh, sorry, there you go, C2B, our next higher floor, and then C2C, the bottom of the lowest horizontal structural member. Essentially, that's the underside of the floor, the underside of this horizontal framing structure item. That's the measurement that you're collecting. And that's because in those coastal high hazard areas, there's added wind and wave action. And so the first thing to be impacted by those wind and waves and extra flooding forces in V zones would be the underside of the floor. So that in V zones is the lowest floor for floodplain management purposes, not this upper enclosure floor. That's why they collect lowest horizontal structural member. So your C2C will often be not applicable. And then you don't have to click feet or meters. Moving down to C2D, we've got attached garages. Again, those are physically attached to the structure, adjacent or next to the principal use of the building. Might be connected by a common wall, might be connected by a breezeway, some other sort of shared foundation item. will collect the information about the top of the slab of that attached garage. If there's not an attached garage, or if it's a fully detached garage that gets its own elevation certificate, just put NA here for attached garage, or if there's nothing to measure. Again, for C2D, we're measuring that lowest point of that slab floor. Remember that this is an enclosure below an elevated building, so this isn't actually C2D, it's C2A, because it's the top of the bottom floor, and then this is the next higher floor. C2D in this case is our attached garage. We'd have C2A and C2B over here if this is a crawl space. Slab on grade might just be C2A. So D for attached garages. Machinery and equipment is really important, and this is one of those things that's kind of commonly missed by surveyors or engineers when filling out a elevation certificate. It's also why it's important to wait for as late as possible to collect that finished construction elevation certificate. So you want to make sure that you've got the lowest elevation of machinery or equipment that's servicing that building. Could be outside the building connected to it on that wall, like the one in the previous photo. It could be inside an attached garage up on a pad, like the water heater. It could be something down in a basement, anywhere else in the building. The NFIP needs to know if the elevation of that machinery and equipment is located at or above the base flood elevation. So again, furnaces, water heaters, AC units, elevators, equipment, ductwork also counts. So here's a nice example of a properly elevated and mounted and protected condenser pad, but this is neither elevated nor protected from flooding. Still going to capture the lowest elevation of the machinery or equipment or ductwork servicing the building, but that's one of those things that you're going to review to make sure that it properly is protected per your ordinance. Okay, every building that is built on the ground or on piers above the ground is somehow connected to the ground, and so is going to have both a lowest adjacent grade and a highest adjacent grade. If that's a fully flat piece of ground, then that lowest adjacent grade or lag number and highest adjacent grade or HAG number are going to be the same. But if it's on a little bit of a hill, your lowest adjacent grade will be a little bit lower than your HAG. So sometimes surveyors will flip this one. So as you're reviewing ECs, make sure that C2F is lower than C2G. You want your lower to be lower than your highest. There's also some new boxes on the form to talk about natural or finished grade. Is this pre-construction, natural, pre-disturbance ground level, or is this the finished flattened grading as the building is done? You're going to measure this right up against the building, not 20 or 30 feet away. This is the adjacent grade directly touching the building at the lowest spot. And then finally, we're looking at that lowest grade elevation at the attached deck support or stairs. So if there's a set of structurally attached stairs or some other deck or cantilever type of thing, what is the lowest adjacent grade for that attached deck or stairs? Again, sometimes this can come into play if you've got a building whose attached deck comes down and touches an area that's either quite a bit lower in grade or over in a different zone. Maybe most of the building's in an AE zone, but that deck reaches over into the VE zone. That can change some compliance decisions that you need to make about a building. So again, if there's no attached deck or stairs that extend from the envelope of the building, then you don't have something to measure here, and you can write NA. Okay, so that's C2A through H. And again, the person completing Section C has to be in Nevada a licensed professional surveyor or engineer. And they're going to use the comments area of Section D to add any relevant or clarifying information. For example, if they used a conversion factor to flip between the old data on the map and their newer datum, 29 to 88, they describe the conversion factor. Typically, you'd see something like the machinery and equipment that I measured in C2E is the condenser pad outside, or it's the water heater in the garage. Some kind of a description of something here. There's a nice big comments field, so we encourage surveyors to use that. I have a question in the chat that someone has seen property owners propose that they're eligible to complete Section C for the pre-construction elevation certificate. I have not heard of that. I know that surveyors or engineers are the ones that have to fill it out for during and final construction, but I would hesitate to allow someone who isn't a licensed professional to complete this section, because the instructions in the form clearly say that that's who is authorized to sign this section. But we do see Section E and F of the form, which I'll talk about next. So I would encourage basically that C and D is for surveyors and professional engineers in Nevada. I'll let Sarah follow up with that on email. And then Section E and F are for anyone to complete. You, me, your babysitter, your mailman, anybody. Okay, Section D, comments. Again, lots of different things that a surveyor or engineer could put in the comment section. What the machinery was that they saw, whether there were engineered float openings in part of the building or all the building, any other things that are worth noting, unique building characteristics, something that made choosing a building diagram difficult, those sorts of things. Okay, E and F can collect similar but slightly less information. This part of the form is used primarily for O zones or A zones where there's not a base flood elevation. There's fewer measurements in E than C, like there's no line for deck or stairs, and there's no line for lag or hag, because above or below the grade is actually what we're measuring a couple of floors against. Again, it can be certified by the homeowner or a community official. You don't need to be a licensed surveyor to fill out E and F. The measurements are just collected with like a tape measure or a yardstick relative to the highest or lowest natural grade whenever that's available. You've also got check boxes for, is this an EC pre-construction, during construction, or finished construction? Again, we're going to measure adjacent grade, so right up next to the building and not 20 feet away. And if available, measure that highest and lowest natural grade. I often get questions about if whether something altered long ago could still be natural grade. Natural grade is defined as the undisturbed natural surface of the ground before any excavation or fill. If you're in doubt, make a note that that's probably finished grade. So again, that adjacent grade, if we're on a hill, it's going to have a lowest adjacent grade that's lower than the highest adjacent grade. Here's an example where we're not quite sure if we know this has clearly been modified in some way. This might be the natural grade out here, just adjacent to the fill pad. Not always possible to know those precisely, especially in redeveloped areas. So that's why it's a good idea to kind of require some pre-construction survey information to capture that natural grade and combo that with site plan reviews to make sure you've got that natural adjacent grade. Again, for Section E and F, we don't need fancy Trimbles or survey equipment. We can use yardsticks, rulers, and tape measures to get the relative height or measurements above or below the lowest adjacent grade and the highest adjacent grade. So just like if you fill out Section C, you have to certify in Section D. The person taking the measurements in Section E will certify their measurements in Section F. If you're the community official and you're asked to complete an elevation certificate in Section A for a property owner, you would sign Section G, the community section, instead of Section F. But otherwise, it's fill out E, sign F. And just like Section D, there's a place for the signature, the date, and the name and mailing address of the person who provided the info so you can get a hold of them, as well as telephone and email addresses. Nice big comments box, for anything that might need more description or notes to self for the future. All right, that brings us to section G of the form. This is called community information. It used to say optional and now it says recommended. This section of the form has been expanded with the new 2023 version, and it's a really useful section of the form for floodplain administrators because it really allows you to connect other parts of the form to your local community permit and variance decisions. There's checkboxes in here that you can use to help document compliance with any of your higher standards, your own community minimum elevation. And as you'll see in bold there, it is required for CRS communities. As I mentioned, CRS communities must use the elevation certificate, and they must fill out a few fields of this section G of the form every single time. Specifically, they've got to fill out G8, indicating whether the permit is for new construction or substantial improvement, because those are the ones CRS collects. They must fill out G11 every time to indicate whether this is a building that for which a variance was issued, and they've got to sign, date, and provide their name on the form every time. So we'll go through the pieces of this highly recommended community information section. It's kind of broken up into three parts, or I like to think of it in three parts. There's some fields about why a local official may have completed sections of the form. So again, at the top you'll see indicator in the instructions that says the local official who's authorized by law or ordinance to administer the community's floodplain management ordinance. Like, are you the authorized official, the floodplain administrator, or some other designee? You can complete these fields of the form. Complete the applicable items. Excuse me, complete the applicable items. So for example, perhaps you got certified as-built information from some other in some other format that wasn't an elevation certificate. You can transfer that certified elevation information into section C and attach that certified info and fill out section G to say, I got this as-built information that belongs in section C. Here's the source, and I'm attaching it to this other elevation certificate so that you can fill out A and B and grab that property info and that firm info. Maybe you're the community official who entered section data into section E of the form. You'd sign in G instead of an F. Or if you completed section H for insurance purposes, you would sign G instead of I. And then there's another option for if you made specific corrections to sections of the form that don't require a surveyor's stamp, you're allowed to make those corrections on a new form and attach the old form. If there's an error in section C of the form that the surveyor or professional engineer made, it's important to just send that elevation certificate back to the surveyor to have them correct it and send it to you on a new form. C and D have to go back to the certifier to redo. Okay, the middle of section G connects that community permit information to the elevation certificate in question. Again, these fields are provided for floodplain management purposes by the community. Maybe this helps you keep track of what permit number and the date that that permit was issued, what for that particular building. Is this a finished construction elevation certificate? Great. What date was the COO issued? You can connect that kind of info. Was this a building, a brand new building, or is this a substantially improved building or a repair of substantial damage? You'll have a class on that next week. For elevations, you can collect some elevation information here as well. And the other thing that's nice about this is the G10 in particular, the community's minimum elevation. You can actually do your, if you have, let's say, 2 feet of freeboard, you can connect B9, which is the published base flood elevation information on the firm, with 2 feet above that number. You can put that number in G10 and say, okay, I've got 2 feet of freeboard. Now as the floodplain reviewer, you're going to look at your community's higher standard in G10 against the information in section C or section E, because that's your community's minimum elevation for floodplain compliance. G11, all right. Yep, G11 again is that variance, was a variance issued for that building. And if yes, there's some attachments that you'd want to provide as well. And then finally, just like the other sections for signatures and comments, there's a nice big space for in the comments field for anything that might need additional description, attachments, or corrections. And you'd put your local official name, title, address, and probably email and a way to get a hold of you. Important to sign and date the form as well. All right, and then finally sections H and I, which I'll cover sort of briefly because, as I highlighted in red here, these are for flood insurance purposes only. This new section of the form is used to measure the first floor height above the building and document if the machinery or equipment is elevated properly or highly enough to qualify for a mitigation discount on flood insurance. It doesn't require surveyed elevations, so just like E and F, you can complete this with a tape measure. You can complete this in any flood zone. It's just collecting a little bit of floor information and a yes or no question about machinery and equipment. This does not give you enough detail to determine what a building's lowest floor is for NFIP compliance. It uses 6 different foundation types, and there's just a couple of questions to fill out. These actually are going to connect to the 11 different building diagrams that we'll spend some more time talking about, so I just wanted to show you that there's 11 different building diagrams, and the foundation types are used only in section H, and they kind of consolidate them into 6 different building types. Excuse me, 6 different foundation types. They could have come up with a different word between diagram and foundation, but here we are. So don't want you to get too confused with all the information on this form. Just wanted to show you that there are a few different foundation types for use in section H, and they're only trying to take a look at is the top of the bottom floor at or above the lowest adjacent grade. They're not collecting, it says include above grade floors only. So if there's a building with a subgrade crawl space or a basement or other below grade enclosure, there's no below the lag checkbox. They're just going to leave that blank, no negative numbers or anything in here. This is just going to be if it's a slab on grade building, split level building, or some other elevated up on something, piers or a crawl space. They'll collect that top of the bottom floor and then the top of the next higher floor if there is one. Or if there's a basement building, they're only going to use H1B to describe the first floor above the ground level. The building diagram number will be captured in A, and that'll help the flood insurance rating individual use this information to figure out how to properly rate the building. And then again, there's just a simple yes or no checkbox. Is the machinery and equipment servicing the building elevated to or above the floor indicated by the H2 arrow? So the foundation type diagrams give an arrow that says if the machinery and equipment is elevated to this arrow, check yes. If not, check no. So if you've got a slab on grade building and the condenser pad's out here, it's not as high as the arrow, you'd check no. Again, not enough detail to determine the lowest floor. This isn't something you're going to be reviewing as standard practice in floodplain management, but you may have individuals ask you to help them complete it. There's lots of nice detailed instructions in the form for this and all the other sections. Again, just like E and F, this is a relative measurement. We're not using fancy Trimbles, just a tape measure or a yardstick to figure out how high off of the existing ground level is the floor of the building. The end of the elevation certificate has 2 pages for building photographs. There's enough room for 4 photos to show all 4 sides of the building. You can, oops, sorry about that. You can add, don't use the scroll wheel. You can add additional pages or attach additional pages if there's additional photographs that need to be provided to show something unique or different about a building. At the very minimum, you have to capture at least 2 sides of the building if it's not possible to capture all 4 sides. Let's say you've got a row house or something where only the front and the back are photographable. But again, 4 photos are preferred. Images should show enough information about the building to support the building diagram number chosen in A7. It's going to show any relevant structural detail, maybe a photo that's an example of the flood openings in the crawl space, those kinds of things. As the reviewer, you can also use these photos to kind of gut check or reality check the given elevations in Section C or Section E. Like, do the photos and the numbers and the BFE all make sense? And with that, let's get into building diagrams. All right, so the Elevation Certificate form has 11 different building diagrams that are representing different construction types. They're numbered 1 through 9, and they're kind of shown here. I know that this looks a little small, but we're going to go through each of them. We go from non-elevated buildings, which are just built up on a slab or a raised slab, or they have a basement, to buildings that are elevated on something. They're either elevated on piers or posts, or elevated on an enclosure, or elevated on a crawl space. So some are non-elevated, some are elevated, and some are basements. 2 and 4 are basements. And remember, these are not allowed as new construction or substantial improvement in most communities, because basements or areas that are fully below grade on all sides are not permitted. So the lowest floor depends on a few things, and one is the building diagram, another is the flood zone, and another is what's going on with the various parts of an enclosure or attached garage. So the lowest floor depends on the building diagram. If it's a raised slab or split level building, the bottom floor, that one with that least high elevation, remember that never changes, that's always C2A. The lowest floor is often the bottom floor in these types of buildings because it's the least high elevation and there's not some other type of thing that's happening over here. For elevated buildings, like those on a crawl space, that lowest floor might be the elevated floor, the next higher floor, C2B, or if the crawl space doesn't have enough vents or there's something else happening down here that does not comply with those non-elevation design requirements, it might be C2A, the bottom floor. So this is always the bottom floor, this is always the next higher floor, but the lowest floor might be either one of these depending on what's happening with the crawl space and the flood openings. And a basement is any area that's below grade on all sides. Doesn't have to be a full story basement to be a basement. It might be a sunken living room or some kind of half height short crawl space that's fully below grade on all sides. If you've got an area that's below grade on all sides, that floor is a basement and that floor is the lowest floor. So 1 through 9, here we go. Diagram 1A is a slab on grade building. This is just they poured the concrete slab. There's no additional thickness to it that brings it up off the ground level. It's a slab on grade, single or multiple story building. It may or may not have an attached garage. These are not common in the special flood hazard area because, as you might imagine, if it's right at grade or right at ground level and you're in the special flood hazard area, your BFE is going to be somewhere up the middle of the wall and that bottom floor is not going to be properly elevated. So not common in the SFHA as new construction or substantial improvement because it's not high enough up above the BFE. C2A is your lowest floor. Here's another example of a diagram 1A, so we can I'll give you the letters as we go along. You can see C2A, like maybe there's a couple inches here as far as the thickness of the concrete or the step down to the paved area, but C2A is our top of the bottom floor. It's our lowest floor for floodplain management purposes. C2F, our lowest adjacent grade, and C2G, our highest adjacent grade. They might be the same if it's a completely flat site. If the diagram 1A building has multiple floors, then you don't put NA for C2B, you just put the next higher floor. Again, we've got our lowest and highest adjacent grade, our bottom floor, our next higher floor. And this is our lowest floor for floodplain management purposes. So we've got our concrete slab, and then they went stick built up the walls, and we've got some nice, wood or brick facing finishings on the building. But the concrete slab is the thing holding up the building. Diagram 1B, that concrete slab gets quite a bit thicker. So these are raised slab on grade or slab on stem wall. Similar distinguishing feature, but the bottom floor is at or above ground level on at least one side. So this is actually a structure where they mitigated it by elevating it and then putting a fill pad with compacted material. So there's no air under there. It's solid all the way through the foundation. So you can see that raised slab or raised slab on stem wall with fill. So we're gonna get it up off the ground a little bit, but there's still no air under there, so it's not elevated on a crawl space. So that's how they split 1A and 1B into slab and thick slab. Our bottom floor is still our lowest floor for floodplain management purposes. If it's got an next higher floor, great. If not, put NA. Diagram 2, just like 1, 2 has the 2A and 2B, but in diagram 2's, you're in a basement. So the distinguishing feature of both the diagram 2's is the presence of an area that is fully below grade on all sides. It might have multiple floors above the basement. It might be a detached or row type house. It may or may not have an attached garage. Again, these are generally not allowed in any flood zone as new construction or substantial improvement because they're a basement. No basements in the floodplain. You'll know you're in a basement because C2A, your bottom floor, will be below both of your grade measurements. So C2A is below grade, it's below your lowest, and it's below your highest. So if C2A is less than both those other numbers, you know you've got a basement. And you know you should be seeing a 2A or a 2B in the building diagram part of the elevation certificate form. If a basement's present, it's our lowest floor for floodplain management purposes. So this is a no-no here. Should be a big red flag when you see that on an EC. 2B is kind of what we call the straight face basement. It might look like it's not a basement because you've got daylight and a nice full story or full size door there or a nice big picture window. But really what you've done is you've built a basement and you've kind of dug out a patio or dug out a stairwell entry or dug out something that makes C2F your lowest adjacent grade right here. So if you're only looking at the measurements and not at the building diagram, as a reviewer, you'd see C2A and C2F be the same number. You'd see C2G being up here, highest adjacent grade up here somewhere. C2B is our next higher floor. And so it might look like this building is at or above grade on one side, but it's really because they've dug out this area. So having diagram 2B as an indicator says that this is the kind of dug out basement scenario you're dealing with here. So it's a basement, but it's not fully underground, but it's definitely still a basement. Its distinguishing features is you've got a bottom floor, which is either, ideally in this special flood hazard area, not living space. Maybe this is an underground garage with like a dugout driveway entry. We'll show you some pictures here in a second. But that bottom floor is truly below grade on all sides. Most of the height of the walls are below ground level at all sides. You can kind of see the distinguishing features in each diagram description. And then that door and area of egress, like you walk outside from that floor and you're definitely below ground. So you know you're in a basement. So here are a couple of examples of what that might look like. You can kind of see those big retaining walls holding back the dirt because clearly you are underground. You've just got a little daylight pocket for yourself underground. So that might be a walkout area with doors to living space, or it might be, a door like this, or areas that have garage doors where you're going down a ramp into the basement garage, which is a basement enclosure used for parking. Okay, diagram 3 is for split level buildings where the bottom floor is at or above ground level on at least one side. So that bottom floor isn't a full basement, but the split level buildings are often on a hill, so it might be sort of partially below grade, but not fully below grade. Remember that definition of the basement is an area that's fully below grade on all sides. So this building has got C2A here, and then it's not a full story number of feet to the next higher floor, C2B. And so if you're just looking at the numbers, you might think that that's a crawl space or some other not full story height thing. But the diagram 3 number in section A of the form tells you, oh, okay, this is a split level building, which is why C2B is over here and not a full story above. We don't need to capture this 3rd level of the building. There's no next higher floor on the form, just C2A for the bottom floor, C2B for the next higher floor, and then our lowest and highest adjacent grade. Diagram 4 is basically a 3 with a basement. So we're still in a split level building, but now that bottom floor is below grade on all sides. So 2s and 4s are our special flood hazard area no-nos. So split level, but in this case, it's a split level and a basement. We're fully below F and G on all sides, and our C2B is not quite a full story above because it's over there on the other side. So 1 through 4 are what we call our non-elevated building types, and 5 through 9 tend to be our elevated building types. That means the building is elevated on something. There's some element of the foundation that's getting the floors of the building up and off the ground. So a diagram 5 is a building that's elevated on piers or posts or piles or parallel shear walls. There may or may not be it may or may not be in a coastal area. They're often seen in coastal areas, but you may have manufactured homes that are built on short posts or piers. It may be only a couple feet off of the ground on piers or posts. I've seen these along the Gulf, and they're just a couple of feet up, but I've also seen them 16 feet off the ground on piers, posts, or piles. So the height of the piers or posts doesn't make a difference. This is the diagram 5. It's up on these columns, and there's just air under there. This one does have a structurally attached deck or stairs, so that's our C2H, but C2A, the top of the bottom floor, is up here off the ground. C2B, the next higher floor, if there is one, if not, NA. You'll also note that this one's got a C2C pointing to the underside of the floor, that lowest horizontal structural member, the underside cross member of the foundation is the lowest floor for floodplain management purposes in those coastal high hazard areas. Otherwise, it's the top of that bottom floor. Next up is a diagram 6 building, which is essentially like a 5, where part of the area below the piers, posts, and piles is enclosed by walls. Probably breakaway walls, especially in a coastal area, but you might end up with these areas as well. So this is a building on a piers, posts, or piles with a full or partial enclosed area below the elevated floor. If it's a fully enclosed area, you still need to think about what's actually holding up the building. So it's these piers or posts that are supporting the building. So that's why it's a building type diagram 6. You'll note the size of the enclosure. Again, these are not allowed, typically not allowed in the special flood hazard area as new construction or substantial improvement because that enclosure would be too low. It's the whole reason for putting the house up on piers or posts. But if that enclosure is unvented, has sufficient flood openings, unfinished, has sufficient venting or flood openings, and is only used for storage, parking, and access, then it's not the lowest floor for floodplain management purposes. So if we see proper flood openings in that enclosure, limited uses, and unfinished space, then our lowest floor becomes the next higher floor. Diagram 7 buildings are elevated on a full story foundation, so full story masonry foundation, like not a wood frame building on a concrete slab. Those are diagram 1s. So full story foundation masonry walls with an enclosure that's a walkout on one side. It's not fully below grade on all sides. It's a full story foundation. It's not a basement because you've got to walk outside. And there's typically openings on those. So we've got an enclosure used for parking. So it's C2A, not C2D. Here's our bottom floor. It's probably partially vented, our walkout level. C2B is our next higher floor. That's going to be our floor for floodplain management compliance if we've got proper openings and everything like that. And again, our C2F, lowest adjacent grade, C2G, highest adjacent grade. There's our Decker stairs back there, C2H. C2E is our machinery somewhere around here, hopefully not down in the basement, but maybe it's the condenser pad around the corner. Openings in that enclosure are necessary for that diagram 7 because, again, if you're in the special flood hazard area, that at-grade floor is below the base flood elevation. So you'll want to see those openings. And because that's an enclosure, those go in A8 and not A9. This is an enclosure with a garage door. Again, bottom floor, next higher floor, machinery, flood openings for the enclosure. I know it's a lot of repetition, but the repetition really does help. All right, finally, diagrams 8 and 9. Diagram 8 is the building elevated on a crawl space. The floor of the crawl space is at or above grade on at least one side, but might be below the highest adjacent grade, but isn't below the lowest. So C2A is at or above C2F. May or may not have an attached garage. You'll see we've got that crawl space, so those crawl space openings need to convey how much opening? 1 square inch of opening per square foot of enclosed area, that 1-to-1 ratio, unless you're using engineered openings. C2B is that next higher floor, and that becomes your lowest floor for floodplain management purposes if that crawl space is properly vented and unfinished. So the diagram 8 crawl spaces are not full story enclosures. Remember how I said in diagram 7, that's a full story masonry enclosure. Full story means more than 5 feet from the bottom floor to the next higher floor. So if the distance from the crawl space floor to the top of the next higher floor is more than 5 feet, that means that crawl space exceeds 4 feet. We're assuming a 12-inch floor joist. So if that crawl space height is more than 4 feet high, you're going to have a difference between C2A and C2B of more than 5 feet. That's actually going to be a diagram 7. And that says so right in the instructions. If the distance from the crawl space floor to the next higher floor is more than 5 feet, that's a 7, not an 8. So if the crawl space is only a few feet high, that's a diagram 8. If there's an attached garage next to the building, that may change what the lowest floor is to if it's below BFE. We want to make sure that that's used only for parking and storage. So if C2A, that crawl space floor, is unfinished and properly vented, then your next higher finished floor becomes your lowest floor for floodplain management purposes. If those crawl space vents get blocked by a future owner or by somebody after finished construction, that actually does change your lowest floor for floodplain management compliance. Remember, if they can be closed or blocked, they can't be counted. They're no longer going to convey the floodwaters. That's no longer a compliant crawl space. Same picture here for a diagram 8 or 9 because it's probably very hard to tell from the outside of the building whether that crawl space is subgrade. So we'll see these scenarios in places where they'll scrape the building pad, set up the building, and then backfill for finished grading, but you'll end up with a crawl space that is subgrade. These are diagram 9s. Again, they're buildings elevated on a crawl space, but that crawl space is subgrade. So to tell the difference between an 8 and a 9, the surveyor's got to get inside that crawl space. Can't always tell the difference from the outside. These are only allowed in a community if your local ordinance specifically allows them by adding the technical information from FEMA's Technical Bulletin 11. It's also important, Technical Bulletin 11 sets some limitations on what can be allowable as a diagram 9. So you have to kind of carefully compare this to the building plans. I like to call this the 2-4-5 rule. C2A, that bottom floor, that crawl space floor, must be no more than 2 feet below the lowest adjacent grade on all sides. So the crawl space can't be too deeply subgrade. It also can't be a full story crawl space, right? We can't have that 5-foot difference between the crawl space floor and the next higher floor. So no more than 2 feet deep subgrade. no more than 4 feet to the underside of the finished floor, no more than 5 feet to the next higher floor. If that is not met, then you actually have a diagram 2A or 2B because you've got a full story subgrade basement. So that's a 2A or a 2B, and those are basements. And remember, not allowed a special flood hazard area, new construction, or substantial improvement. Technical Bulletin 11, available in the same place as the link I showed you at TB1, talks about the specific requirements and that 245 rule. So no more than 2 feet deep from that lowest adjacent grade to C2A, no more than 4 feet to the underside of the floor, which, if we're assuming a 12-inch floor joist, gives us 5 feet between C2A and C2B. If those conditions are all met and your local ordinance allows a Diagram 9 construction, you're good to go. If any of these conditions are not met, that is actually a basement and that's non-compliant. All right, so I've been threading this throughout the whole presentation, but we're just going to kind of reinforce this idea of the lowest floor, right? We have in C2A through H a bunch of information. It's not a field on the elevation certificate, but it might be one of these fields, right? Your lowest floor for floodplain management purposes might be the bottom floor. It might be the top of the next higher floor. It might be the attached garage with the machinery in it. So you really need to kind of look at the building diagram and the numbers provided. The lowest floor depends on a couple of those different factors. Building diagrams, which we've just talked about, flood zone, which I'll sort of show you next, and then what's happening with any enclosures or attached garages that are present, as well as the location of machinery or equipment. Remember, these are just objectively recorded floors by the surveyor or the professional engineer, and it's your job as a local floodplain administrator to take a look at this and to take a look at the building diagram information and your local community's freeboard standards and make that determination. So a little bit of math, but at least it's not algebra. All right, so the lowest floor depends on the building diagram. It also depends on the flood zone. I know this isn't applicable in Nevada, but for your general knowledge, this is those lowest floors in V zones. Remember those coastal high hazard areas, we're doing that underside of the floor, that lowest horizontal structural member, C2C, becomes the lowest floor for floodplain management purposes versus the top of that bottom floor. So could depend on the building diagram, could depend on the zone, and it could depend on what's happening with what the building is elevated on. So if you've got a slab on grade building, pretty straightforward. The first floor that's sitting on that slab is your bottom floor and it's your lowest floor. But typically, if we're thinking about enclosures, our lowest floor definition that we talked about way back at the beginning of the presentation is that if there's an unfinished or flood-resistant enclosure that's used only for parking and access or limited storage in an area that's not a basement and that has sufficient flood openings and meets all those foundation requirements, it may not be the building's lowest floor. So all of those following things that are outlined in CFR are that it's unfinished, that it's constructed with flood damage resistant materials, because right below the BFE needs to have flood resistant materials and methods. The design requirements for flood openings to allow that water to automatically pass through in both directions and equalize that hydrostatic and hydrodynamic pressure. That's that 1-to-1 ratio. We've got to have at least 2 openings that provide 1 square inch of net open area for each square foot of enclosed area, right? 900 square feet of crawl space, 900 square inches of opening. That area can only be used, if it's below the BFE, for limited storage, parking, or access. Not as living space, not as a game room, not as a temporary like TV watching area. That's only limited storage, parking a vehicle, or accessing the building. It's also important that the enclosed area is not a basement. Remember, if it's fully below grade on all sides, that basement becomes the lowest floor for floodplain management purposes. So these are the things you're going to kind of pay attention to when you're reviewing that elevation certificate, as well as you're reviewing your site plans during permit applications. So just to put it all together, determining compliance for that lowest floor really requires you as the reviewer to look at the building diagram selection and say, what kind of a building do I have? Do I have a slab on grade building? Do I have a raised slab on grade building? Is this a split level building? Is it elevated on a crawl space? And that'll help you inform your review of the floor or floors, the location and elevation of any machinery or equipment servicing the building, whether or not it has an enclosure used for parking or just an enclosure like a crawl space or an attached garage. That information would be filled out in A8 or A9 respectively. Are there flood openings for those things? If they're below base flood elevation, which you get in section B, then they need to have that 1-to-1 ratio. You're also considering the finishing and the use of that, right? Storage, parking, and access only, unfinished only, if it's below BFE. And then the photos should really reinforce all of these numbers and choices throughout the rest of the form. So this really means cross-checking multiple sections of the elevation certificate. Sometimes I'll draw out my own diagram and write the numbers on it to help me kind of put it all together in a picture. And that is why an elevation certificate is so useful for helping you determine a building's lowest floor. So capturing that EC at finished construction to help you make sure that you've got a fully compliant building before you're issuing that certificate of occupancy. So let's walk through an example, right? So we'll put some real numbers to this. Let's say we've got a building elevated on a crawl space. That's building diagram 8. It's not a full story crawl space. So our surveyors selected building diagram 8. We're in an AE zone, so we have a base flood elevation published by FEMA. We're going to use the flood insurance study and the flood insurance rate map together at that particular site to say, okay, the published BFE at this location is 105.9 feet, ABD 88. Let's say this is a community that has 1 foot of freeboard required, so they're going to use section G of the form and say, all right, well, the flood insurance rate map, FEMA says the BFE is 105.9. We're going to go 1 foot above that. So our community's minimum elevation is 106.9. So we want to make sure that the building's lowest floor is above 106.9. So because it's AE, we're going to see sections C and D filled out. And again, no row that actually says the lowest floor, so we're just going to collect all this information. Our building diagram 8 says that our crawl space bottom floor, C2A, is 105.4. That's not going to work. Nope. So next higher floor is 108.1. We don't have a lowest horizontal structural member that we care about, and this particular building happens to not have an attached garage. It does, however, have machinery and equipment servicing it. This is kind of a commonly missed item, so make sure that almost every building that is lived in is going to have some kind of machinery or equipment servicing it. So that machinery equipment is maybe, we're not sure where it is because we can't see the comments section, but it's above the community's freeboard. The lowest and highest adjacent grade look like they're organized correctly. They're both finished grade, and our lowest is lower than our highest. There's also no attached deck or stairs servicing that building. Do we have enough information to know if this building is compliant? Put your answer in the chat. Yes, no, or maybe we need something else. All right, we probably do need a little bit more information. Yep. Okay, so we've got our bottom floor and our next higher floor. If we go back to section A, we know that we have a crawl space. So because this is a crawl space building selected, we'd expect to see some crawl space information filled out here as well. So again, making sure that the building diagram number makes sense with all the information that's provided. So we've got an 800 square foot crawl space. And we're learning that there's at least one permanent flood opening on 2 different sides of the enclosure. Great. We've got 6 non-engineered flood openings. And the calculation that was provided to us that says all 6 of those openings together have a net open area of 840 square inches. This number versus this number, because this number is bigger, right? We have at least that 1-to-1 ratio. If this was 740, no good. But 840, we've got more than 1 square inch per square foot of enclosure. So that then tells me that C2A is not our lowest floor. C2B, that shouldn't be the underside of the floor, that should be the top of the floor, sorry about that. The lowest floor is actually our next higher floor. If the flood openings, if there weren't any flood openings or they weren't within 1 foot above adjacent grade, now we no longer have our 1-to-1 ratio. And our lowest floor is that bottom floor, C2A. So this one would be our non-compliant one. All right, I hope that was a helpful walkthrough example for a crawl space. Just want to kind of review each of the sections of the form and point out a couple of common errors that you may tend to see. In section A, you might see things like the wrong building diagram selected, or property information that doesn't tell you the actual location of the structure, or maybe doesn't give you a proper use information. It doesn't say residential, non-residential, or accessory. It says shop. And I don't know if that shop means it's a detached garage, or if that shop means it's a shopping plaza. So make sure that they're giving you proper descriptions of what type of building that is. Again, remember that the elevation certificate form has several pages of instructions that are highly detailed and will give you a lot of the information that you need to properly complete the form as well as properly review the form. So make sure the building diagram makes sense, check it against the photos, make sure if there is a crawl space or an attached garage or both, that all that information is provided in section A. In section B, some of the things that surveyors tend to get wrong is the map date or the base flood elevation, or putting the wrong community name or ID number, or incorrectly determining that base flood elevation. Section A and B of the form can be filled out by anyone, so it is important to check and make sure that anyone filled it out correctly. Section C or E of the form, where we're collecting either surveyed elevations or measurements about a building's floors. Remember, don't leave blanks in the form. If there's nothing to measure, put NA, because 0 actually means, in those sections, 0 means 0 feet above sea level, and that's by and large not going to be accurate. So put NA if there's nothing to measure. Surveyors sometimes also forget to check the box that says feet. I know we're going to assume that it's going to be feet, but it's important to know that it's not, not meters or not cubits or something like that. They've got to check the box that says feet. Missing machinery and equipment is often done, especially if they're collecting that finished construction EC too early. And then not checking all the numbers against the building diagram and the BFE, and ending up with a lowest floor that is too low. Too low, I mean below the BFE. If the person filling out section C forgets to sign, stamp, or certify or date or sign the appropriate section, that's a common EC error we see. And then section G, again, recommended for everybody to use, required for CRS communities to use. So I put in here section G, missing information, can be a common EC error, particularly for CRS communities. But again, really encourage everyone to make use of section G of that form. It is there for your ease of record keeping as a community official. And as I showed you, for ease of helping track your community's freeboard requirements if you have them. And again, important to make sure that there are sufficient photos attached to that elevation certificate to verify what's been built and that it aligns with the permits that you issued and that the information that's collected on the form. Common errors that a surveyor makes is assuming that a structure that's built on fill or ground above the BFE is automatically above the floodplain, and so they just decide that it's in Zone X. Using the wrong datum without converting to the same one used on the firm. Again, if you've got older maps that are still on 1929 datum, keep an eye out for that. Make sure that they're using a datum conversion. Needing an attachment but not attaching one, or forgetting to check an attachments box, or checking a box because we just kind of got into the mode of box checking and then didn't attach something. Again, make sure that those things all align with what's actually happening in the form and what's connected to the form. Don't leave fields blank, put NA if they don't apply, and definitely use the comments fields. That's definitely why those large boxes are there. It's important to leave yourself information and breadcrumbs for future. Common community errors: not requiring a finished construction as-built elevation certificate after final grading, after the condenser pad's been put in, after, as late as possible, so that you have an accurate representation of all machinery and equipment, all finished grading, all the things that could possibly change a building's lowest floor. Making sure that those flood openings were installed and then not blocked with styrofoam. Making sure that that finished construction EC really represents the full and final as-built scenario. Don't cross out things on a form to make corrections. Again, use Section G of the form on a new form. Make the corrections that you need to and attach the old form, so you've got a clear track record of what has happened and then showing your work. Again, really encourage everyone to use Section G to make comments, enter permit information, track your permit types and COO dates and variances and those kinds of things. And really, as we said at the very beginning, just because somebody hands you an EC does not mean that building is compliant. It just means that they recorded some elevations about some floors. Don't accept an elevation certificate and just put it in a drawer or put it in your records without reviewing it for completeness and accuracy, and reviewing it to make sure that it shows that the building complies with your local regulations. So problems on an EC might be a couple of different things, and this is why I wanted to provide you all with this handout as well. You might see errors on the form that indicate the building is fine, but the form wasn't completed correctly. So that might be those missing checkboxes, or picking the wrong building diagram, or something else that doesn't make sense on the form, but there's nothing when you actually go and look at the building itself that means the building is non-compliant. It just means they goofed on the form. Those are easier things to fix than problems on an EC that represent the surveyor collected the correct information, but the information represents a building that's in violation or that has some sort of non-compliant issue, like they blocked all the flood vents and so the surveyor didn't count them, or they, poured the attached garage floor too low, or something like that. The form was filled out correctly, but the building isn't right or compliant. And then that last bullet is kind of a CRS violations or gigs list type of thing. For those of you who are in the CRS program, you know that you need to submit all of your elevation certificates every year to your specialist for review, and you have to have a 90% passing rate. So checking accuracy of these forms as you go throughout the year is very important so that you can stay in the CRS program. There might be errors or violations or things that CRS is particularly picky about that end up on this elevation certificate checklist. But we do like to point this out as a useful tip sheet that anybody, whether you're in CRS or not, can use to help you make sure that the right information is being provided to you as a floodplain administrator on those forms. All right, go ahead and open up your chat boxes, and we're going to run through a couple of examples or knowledge checks to sort of put it all together. So here's that slab-on-grade building. C2A is our bottom floor. Here's our grade, our highest grade. C2D is our attached garage. Which number building diagram is this? Go ahead and type that into the chat. Give everybody just a second. All right, seeing some mixed answers, but most folks are saying 1A, and that's correct. Yep. Diagram 1A, slab on grade buildings are 1s. Slab on grade is at 1A, and a raised slab on grade is a 1B. How about this one? We're up on piers, posts, or piles, or parallel shear walls. We're out on the coast. What building diagram number is this? It's our first elevated building type. All right, 5s across the board. Yep, you guys got it. I know you're not going to see a lot of these, but again, you may see them as manufactured homes, but wanted to point this one out. So if we enclosed part of that area, we're going to have a diagram 6, but piers, posts, or piles is a 5. Okay, if we have this area where C2A is lower than C2F and C2G, but C2B is higher than C2F and C2G, what's the lowest floor here? Is it A or B or F? A, nice. Yep, if there is a basement in the building, that basement is the building's lowest floor. We're below grade on all sides. C2A is less than C2F and G, so we know we've got a basement. That's our lowest floor. Okay, we have a building here located in this flood zone. What section or sections of the form are we going to fill out to collect information about the floors and the garages of this building? We're going to fill out A and B and what other sections of the form? Kristen's got it. C and D, yep. So because this is a zone AE, we've got a base flood elevation established or published. So we're going to need a surveyor or professional engineer to fill out section C and then certify that information in section D. How about in this house over here? What fields would be filled out for the floors for this building? Do we still need C and D? Nice, Lewis. E, yep. So in zone A, let's assume we don't have a published base flood elevation. Yep. Kristen brings up a good point. So this is, let's say this building is partially in zone X and partially in zone A. Because we're in zone A, we're still going to collect information about that building. It's in the special flood hazard area, so the floodplain rules apply. We're going to collect measurements in section E, but you, me, or anybody can fill that out and then sign it in section F. Because there's no published BFE, we don't need a surveyor or engineer to fill out section C and D, although we could, but C and D have to be filled out in zone AE. In zone A, you can optionally fill out E and F instead of C and D. Okay, back to building diagrams. How about this one? This is a raised slab on grade. We've got a nice solid floor and we're up above our adjacent grade a little bit. Ooh, you guys are fast with that one. Yep, 1B. Diagram 1B. So raised slab on grade. 1A was just our slab, 1B is our raised slab on grade. But there's still, again, no air under there. This isn't an 8 because we don't have crawl space air. All right, how about this one? This one's elevated. I've got some CMU bricks, it looks like. It's holding up this building. Yeah. Scattered responses. This one tends to be tricky. This is actually a diagram 7. It could confusingly look like a 6, but a 6 would be piers, posts, or piles. And in this case, so piers, posts, or piles with wood frame walls or maybe breakaway walls or some other framing. This isn't framing. This is a full-story masonry enclosure. So this is the diagram 7. It's not a 2 because it's not below grade. It's not a 6 because it's not piers or posts. It's a 7 because it's a full story, more than 5 feet from the bottom floor to the next higher floor. All right, and a couple last things. So if we've got a building in the special flood hazard area and its lowest floor is above the its top of the bottom floor, C2A, is above the base flood elevation, but it's got this garage down here, C2D, our attached garage. What would be the rules for this not to be the lowest floor, this garage to not be the lowest floor? That might be a lot of typing, so I think I will just go through the pieces. Brian's got it. Yep, openings. So it can't be a basement. It should be unfinished area and have limited uses, right? Yep, Janelle, you got it. Vented and provided for storage or parking or building access only. So still written in C2D, but what you do want to see here is flood openings, unfinished space, properly elevated utilities, used only for storage, parking, and access. What you don't want to see is one of those, right? That changes whether it's still C2D, but it's no longer not the lowest floor. So may not be the lowest floor for floodplain management compliance, probably becomes the lowest floor. Down here going to have a problem because clearly finished space, clearly still has a garage door, clearly not used for storage, parking, and access. This is living space. It's got some carpets, it's been painted, all the things. All right, and then finally, we've got an enclosure beneath an elevated building. This is a piers and post example, but you could think about this with the crawl space as well. For floodplain management purposes, which of these is the lowest floor, A or B? Split answers here, but look, this one has, if we've got our base flood elevation, because this doesn't have any openings and it's below BFE, this is our lowest floor. It's our bottom floor and our lowest floor. But we could change this to make the building compliant by adding flood vents to the enclosure, making sure that it's unfinished space used only for storage, parking, and access. Then B would be our lowest floor. If we were in a V zone, C2C would be on the just underside of the floor, but you guys are in Nevada, so I didn't want to confuse the issue. So making sure that if you've got a floor below the base flood elevation, flood-resistant materials and methods, one-to-one openings, unfinished space, limited uses. All the things to keep in mind. And the EC helps you collect that. Okay, going to wrap it all up with some final hints for reviewers. Make sure that you have that complete and correct finished construction elevation certificate as a condition of issuing that certificate of occupancy. That way you make sure you're going to get that final EC for your records. Because anyone can fill out section A and B of the form, it's kind of a recommended practice or some possible good idea to, at the permit counter, at the time of permit application or submittal, you can actually, as the floodplain administrator, fill out portions of that elevation certificate for applicants. You can help them fill out section A. You can provide the firm and FIS information that goes in section B. That way you know the correct base flood elevation has been provided. It's important to establish a review process to make sure that those forms are complete and correct. Don't just collect it, see that it's got a stamp on it, and stick it in a drawer. Remember, it's the surveyor's job to write down the measurements that exist, and it's your job to make sure that those measurements reflect a compliant building. Section G is a great tool that you can use to provide additional community information and connect this to your permit decisions, your freeboard, variance requirements, leave yourself comments for the future, those kinds of things. With that, I want to say thank you all very much for your time, and I hope that was useful training for you.